Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and this video, sponsored by Xbox, is a compilation of our favourite HDR titles for Xbox One X. And joining me to discuss the footage, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, how's it going? Let's dig into some HDR goodness, shall we?
Okay, so first of all, let's talk about HDR on YouTube. You need a compatible device or screen to see this video running the way it should be. Otherwise, you'll just be seeing a standard tone maps image, which won't look any different from average capture. So Samsung TVs, Roku devices, even some smartphones can support HDR. And we're going to be kicking off here with Assassin's Creed Origins. So you took the capture for this one, John. Why don't you talk a little about it?
So this is the first game in the series to support HDR, and I think it looks pretty good overall. It has a nice HDR configuration screen as well, which allows you to independently adjust the black and white points, which is useful for matching it to the capabilities of your TV, since tone mapping is kind of all over the place right now, and I think it works really well overall. There's a little bit of black crush, but we also see that in standard dynamic range. But really, HDR just sort of gives the game a more vibrant appearance overall. It uses a combination of very bright highlights, but it also sort of like allows for more impressive sort of dark atmospheric scenes. Like, for instance, this scene here, you're kind of running through the city at night, and there's, you have the very intense moonlight in the distance, which looks awesome, but it's really like all the fire and torch effects that I think that really stand out here. And this is the kind of stuff that I think you really only get with HDR. It's something that's not really possible without it. And it does make a big difference in terms of building atmosphere, sort of creating a world that you just want to explore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really impressed with this title for a number of reasons, but specifically for HDR. I mean, I spoke to the director of technology for the title the other day, and the actual lengths that they went to ensure that you got that configurability in the game was just exceptional. So it turns out that Ubisoft Montreal is right next to the HQ of Artings, the site that rates HDR screens. So they got in contact with them and basically just took their kit around to their studio and basically tested their code on essentially every single HDR screen that those guys had to hand. And the consensus that they came up with was that they needed those two settings there, which is the peak luminance and the kind of paper white level. So yeah, the paper white is kind of like the HUD white level, and obviously peak luminance is, well, peak brightness. And yeah, it's a really simple interface here, but you get an immense level of control over the HDR experience. And they were saying that the main issue they had is that there isn't any kind of reference common HDR screen. Now, this is something that we've talked about in the past. But yeah, I just love the simplicity and the versatility of the solution here.
Yeah, I agree. It's nice to see this configuration option in there while developers are still kind of figuring out how to implement it. Some of the other games on this list also have similar options available, but others don't really provide any way to adjust the picture at all. And depending on which displays were used during the creation of the game, you can get some subpar results on a display that doesn't match. So yeah, ACO's solution is pretty good right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just generally, I just think the game is really fantastic to look at as well. Temporal anti-aliasing solution there, which I understand was ported across from For Honor.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and we both know how good that title actually looks on a 4K screen. I'm really looking forward to the Xbox One X patch for that. So yeah, that's where the temporal anti-aliasing solution came from, the scalability, the dynamic scaler in there as well. I just think this is a really lovely 4K experience, and the HDR, icing on the cake.
Yep, absolutely.
Good stuff. Okay, so let's move on to our next title.
Forza 7. I think that's another big one. This is a title that I first experienced in HDR back at E3, but on a lesser television. And now that I actually have it at home on the Xbox One X, running it on an OLED TV, it does look really good in HDR. It's an extremely vibrant game. It definitely... The main thing I think, of course, as I've seen in a lot of HDR games, is the sky. You get that really intense sky that like contrasts against the ground, and it really helps sort of the somewhat more realistic looking tracks, which have often kind of appeared more pedestrian just by their very nature. suddenly sort of take on a dramatic look that you didn't really see before. And it works really well here.
Yeah, I mean, we've both got the LG B6 OLED screen,
right,
which is fantastic for Xbox One X, and I can tell you that the B6 screen was the one that I saw at Turn 10 Studios. So yeah, I mean, there is so many different HDR implementations out there, but at least we know we're going to get a great experience. I suspect many other people will too. I think the thing to bear in mind with this one, yes, it's all about the skyboxes, and there is some fantastic stuff there, but also the wet weather conditions.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and the reflection work that's going on there just looks absolutely glorious in HDR. So yes, this is another key title, and obviously this one is native 4K locked 60 frames per second, so it's kind of like a kind of showcase game, I think, for Xbox One X and for HDR.
Yes, I agree. It looks great. So then the next one is a bit of a surprise, I think, and one that most people wouldn't expect to be on this list, but it's Homefront: The Revolution. Now, yeah, right? You didn't expect that one.
Yeah, wow. I mean, this is a game that's kind of been almost dormant for some time. I mean, it came out a while back. It did get a PlayStation 4 Pro upgrade, which we kind of overlooked at the time. We're going to go back and look at that at some point, stack it up against the X. But yes, we were talking about this the other day, weren't we? And you were blown away by how good this game looks on Xbox One X in HDR.
Yeah, I really didn't expect it, because truth be told, the last time I really played the game was back around launch on an Xbox One, when I was sort of capturing some footage for one of the videos, and it had an uncapped frame rate, it had screen tearing everywhere, there was bugs, slowdown, the whole thing just felt unfinished to me. And so to load it up again like this week and see what it is now, it really is like transformed into something completely different. I mean, the resolution has been boosted up to, I think it's in the 1800p range, no checkerboarding there, really nice temporal anti-aliasing, and a frame rate that's completely rock solid, on top of excellent texture filtering, awesome visuals, and of course, they added HDR to the mix, and this game really shines with it. Right out of the beginning, you actually start the game at night in the rain, so you've got really intense bright signs and spotlights and everything all around the scene, and the really nice reflections on the water, and all of that just works to create this extremely vivid looking game that is nothing like I remembered it. And even when you get to the city later and the sun's up, it's just it just looks really, really vibrant in a way that I didn't expect, and it now feels polished and finished, almost as if maybe it shouldn't have been released, when it was, but we don't know the circumstances around that. But I am happy that they were given the chance to go back and actually finish the game, and it looks great.
Yeah, a few notes from me on this one. I mean, I think possibly one of the most criminally underused technologies of the current generation has been CryEngine, and we never got a next-gen, or as it were, current-gen Crysis entry. And yes, we had Rise back in 2013, launch title on Xbox One, but beyond that, not a huge amount of utilization of CryEngine, and we never really got to see it flex its muscles. So I'm really glad that, yeah, the Homefront is now in a really good position. And 1800p temporal anti-aliasing, it looks pretty awesome. And you were actually saying back when you first tested it that you kind of think it might even pass for native 4K.
Yeah, from my normal viewing distance with the clarity of it, my first thought was, oh wow, this looks like native 4K. But if you actually get in closer and really start to count the pixels, it's like, okay, it's a little bit lower, but the results are really crisp. But I think what you're saying about CryEngine makes a lot of sense. CryEngine hasn't been well utilized this generation. Most of the games that shipped with it on Xbox One and PS4 just haven't run all that well. I mean, that's the engine that powered the infamous Lichdom Battle Mage, if you remember that one.
How could I forget?
I do need to test that, actually. I want to see how it runs on the X. But needless to say, Homefront also suffered from many of the same issues at launch. So yeah, maybe it's just a case of it needed more development time, but it also kind of feels like we needed this next jump in console technology to actually get to the point where you could do an ambitious CryEngine game on consoles without bad performance.
I agree entirely. Good stuff. So let's move on to our next title. And what do you got for us, John?
Well, the next one I really like is Final Fantasy 15.
Okay, yeah, this is a fascinating one, isn't it? Now, back in the day when you first saw this on PS4 Pro, I remember that you were raving about the HDR support on it. And obviously that comes across to Xbox One X lock, stock and barrel with higher resolution and no checkerboarding. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. The game makes use of the same great HDR technique, and it does run at a higher resolution than any other console version yet. Sort of using a dynamic resolution with a really strong temporal anti-aliasing. It's maybe a little rough, but in the end, the overall image quality is pretty decent. It's a big step up from the other versions of the game, and you get that proper frame pacing now in the high mode, which is a key thing. But yeah, it's the overall presentation of Final Fantasy 15. I think it really shows the strength of what you can do with intense colors. And it's not just bright greens and blues and all that. I mean, there's these scenes where it's like sort of at dusk and the sun is setting, and there's just this intensity to the colors and the way the lighting plays off of the various surfaces that just looks really, really good. And of course, this is one of the few games of this size which features real-time global illumination, which helps with things like light bounce and generally creating a more realistic looking world. But it's also one of the reasons why this game has been so difficult to run on consoles, really.
Yeah, they got there in the end though, and as you say, the Xbox One X version, there are some performance snafus in various areas which we're really hoping that Square will address. But generally speaking, across the run of play, locked 30 frames per second, proper frame persistence, 33 milliseconds per frame, looks absolutely beautiful, and once again, HDR, icing on the cake.
Yep, it's an awesome looking game. So, if we go from there, I think the next one is another interesting title, because up until now, this has not had HDR support, and of course I'm talking about Rise of the Tomb Raider.
Right, now this is an interesting one, because back at the launch of GTX 1080 on PC, I did actually get to see the game running in HDR, and this was like, years ago now, and there was even a blog by Nixis about, how they did it, but the actual HDR support never came out on PC, and now we're finally getting it on Xbox One X. And I remember back at the time thinking, this looks absolutely awesome, and now we do finally have it, and well, yeah, it is quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really it's interesting to see, because this is a game I've probably covered more than just about any other game this generation, so I'm very familiar with how it looks. So loading it up with HDR enabled, it definitely changes the way the game looks in some pretty meaningful ways. And again, it has a lot to do with the high intensity highlights for things like the sky, flames and various other things like that. But it does create sort of a different atmosphere in the world that I didn't really feel without it. So it does feel like a significant step up in that way. And in a way, it feels like kind of a return home, if you will, because Rise of the Tomb Raider started out as an Xbox exclusive game, then it went over to the PC, then we got the PlayStation version, and it seemed like each version was getting better, and now they've kind of come back around, and now the Xbox One X version is the best console version, so it kind of worked out.
And of course there are 3 different modes here. There's a high frame rate mode, there's the enriched 4K mode, and the native 4K mode. And the HDR support obviously is common to all of them.
That's right. And all 3 modes are interesting. I need to do some more testing on it, but right now I've kind of been waffling between the native 4K mode and the enriched 4K mode. The unlocked frame rate mode is neat in some areas, but it's still, getting to that solid 60 frames per second is not quite in the cards, and the game really wasn't made for that on consoles, I think, and you can really feel it, but it does get closer than the Pro did, but still not all the way there. Whereas the 4K modes definitely seem to hold 30 frames per second at least 95% of the time, or 99% of the time even. It's very, very stable.
Mm-hmm. I think what impressed me about this one was, you spend a fair bit of time underground, and black is black here, light is light, and that is kind of radically different from the SDR version. You do get that kind of full gamut of HDR there. They really lay it on the line, and the specular highlights in particular, like the wet rocks, that kind of thing. It's just super illuminated and maybe possibly overblown. I mean, possibly I need to figure out what to do with that HDR slider, because there is one in this game. But yeah, it really emphasizes the kind of physically based materials in there.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great example.
Okay, good stuff. So, next game.
We're going to continue with the Square Enix train here. Well, At least it used to be, but now it's kind of independent, and I'm talking about Hitman, which did receive a very, very impressive Xbox One X update. So IO Interactive has proven themselves to be really good at this. They did an awesome update last year for the PS4 Pro, and they were really excited about the Xbox One X update, and after playing it, I see why.
Okay, so give us the headlines here, because, well, obviously, we have a bit of a history with this game. We use it as a GPU and CPU benchmark, because you can basically use the unlocked frame rate to hit bottlenecks on either, but they've actually done a lot of work there in terms of performance, and there is actually a 60 frames per second mode here, as well as a native 4K mode.
Yes, that's right. So obviously then there's the HDR support, which is a nice thing here, but it's the two modes that really make a difference, and they're not, I don't believe they're named any differently from before. We always had an unlocked frame rate option on consoles, and you've always had the option to lock it down. And that's the same here, but the difference is that the lower resolution mode with the unlocked frame rate now runs at basically a locked 60 frames per second for nearly all the game, at least that I've tested.
Wow, so that includes the Paris stage with all of the...
Yeah,
all of those NPCs.
You walk into the busiest room at the Paris stage and it drops to maybe at worst like 55 to 57 frames per second, and it doesn't even last. I mean, it pops right back up to 60. I really didn't expect such a dramatic upgrade in terms of performance. It's really impressive.
Yeah, and they've actually been toying with the aesthetic of the game too, right? I mean...
Yeah, they've kind of messed with some of the lighting, and I guess they've added sort of more volumetric effects into the mix, and it does have a different look to it.
Wow, that's really interesting stuff. So what's the HDR looking like then?
So yeah, Hitman kind of goes for a different look than a lot of other games on this list, as you've seen, and it's a very atmospheric game, despite, its focus on killing, and it kind of presents sort of natural environments, usually at a very beautiful time of day. Like the Paris stage is obviously at dusk, right as the sun is setting below the horizon there, and Sapienza's right during the middle of the day with the bright sun, and they kind of go around with that. And as you'd expect then, HDR basically amps up the high intensity highlights, and the darker missions, like Paris, receive sort of an extra layer of depth and richness to the dark areas that you didn't really see before. So basically, when you combine all of that together, you're just left with a really visually attractive game. It looks really nice, I think, and their engine, this is Glacier 2, I think, still. It really does an awesome job.
Okay, so next up, we're going to be taking a look at Call of Duty World War II, which has quite a unique way of utilizing HDR, right?
Yeah, so the first thing to note is when you first boot up the game, all of the, videos and such, they're designed to be played back in HDR, but it's supposed to be like black and white stock footage looking stuff, which that in and of itself is kind of fascinating because the whites are kind of amped up in a weird way, so you're kind of watching black and white HDR footage, not something you'd expect. But once you get into the game, it sort of goes for a much more muted look than any of the other games on this list, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. But then they really kind of blow out the highlights in a good way for things like flames, explosions, and sometimes the sunlight, in a way that kind of makes it rather striking. Like you'll be running through a bunker, taking out guys, and then, explosions go off, and it's sort of like this blinding effect that kind of hits you as things explode, which does actually leave quite an impression, I think, when it happens. And so you're not just like running around seeing lots of super bright specular highlights. It's a very gritty, grainy looking game, but those extra, bright explosions really do benefit.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this one, because I think the emphasis they're trying to go for in the aesthetic, sort of a mixture of realism and a kind of filmic look.
Exactly.
So it's very soft. It's a very soft looking game, but a very realistic looking game. And the use of materials is spot on. Skin shaders, quite remarkable. I mean, it is really interesting to see what those Call of Duty studios are doing every year in what they can cram into a 16.7 millisecond time slice. There's so much going on for a 60 frames per second title here, and they're really trying to push the envelope here. And this game does have a very sort of specific aesthetic, and I think it's kind of like, and returning to the whole boots on the ground thing, they've really gone for a kind of matching war is hell aesthetic here, and I'm actually quite fascinated by this HDR implementation that again is used in a kind of almost a more utilitarian way as opposed to trying to wow you.
Exactly, and the whole thing is kind of fascinating to look at because there's such a long history of World War II games in gaming, but we haven't seen one for so long, so the leap in technology since the last attempt at this is so significant that it's kind of like we're getting a look at what that tech can bring to the table. I mean, the Normandy invasion has been done a million times before, so I was kind of like, okay, here we go again, but it was kind of neat to see it remade with this advanced graphics technology and the ability to do such complex animations and special effects that just were not possible before, so it kind of has a new feeling and impact to it that was missing.
Yeah, and it's a 2160p title, horizontal scaling, possible checkerboarding on this. They still need to do some work on that, I think, to iron out some of the artifacts that crop up. But, fascinating game overall, and I'm looking forward to checking it out in HDR myself. Okay, so let's complete the list, and we're going to return to a Microsoft first-party studio, the Coalition, Gears of War 4, and this is the game that kind of turned you on to HDR in gaming at the first place, right?
Yeah, so that's kind of the reason I wanted to mention it real quick, is it does still look great in HDR, but I first saw it back at E3 2016 when they announced the Xbox One S, and they showed it running on an OLED TV on the Xbox One S next to the PC version running on an LCD. And seeing the game in HDR on an OLED TV pretty much made me say, like, all right, I got to go buy one of these. And I did within like a month.
Good stuff. Yeah, and again, this is a fantastic looking game. Masses of detail here, beautiful effects, and a really strong HDR implementation. And once again, the Xbox One X version has that performance mode that does a pretty good job of giving 60 frames per second gameplay at 1080p. But again, you do retain HDR support there.
Yeah, and the 60 frames per second mode is pretty neat, I have to admit. But honestly, I do prefer playing at the 4K 30 frames per second mode just because it's very stable, and Gears 4 has extremely nice motion blur. So it winds up looking pretty good overall.
And of course, funny you should mention Xbox One S. All of these games obviously do have base Xbox versions, and I'm pretty confident in saying that they should also work in HDR as well. And it's a feature that should be common to both the S and the X. So we're kind of concentrating on the new shiny 4K console here, but the base machine still has much to offer.
Yeah, it's great that HDR support is available there if you're running an S.
Okay, so we haven't tested every single HDR title available on the Xbox One X at the moment. These are the ones we've tried. These are the ones that blew us away. So do check them out. But for now, thanks for that, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. Okay, so as always, please do like and subscribe and follow us on Twitter to support what we do here at Digital Foundry. And this is an HDR video, of course. So supporters of the Digital Foundry Patreon can head on over to digitalfoundry.net and can download a pristine copy of this video at source file quality, 4K HDR, copy it to a USB stick, plug it into your TV, and you're good to go. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.